Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about data analytics in the enterprise market and specifically SAP's offering, including the concept of analytics everywhere. To discuss that, I'm joined by Irfan Khan, President, HANA Database and Analytics at SAP. Irfan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to get your sense of where we are with the data analytics market these days in terms of are companies successful or maybe not so successful? I mean, I hear there's plenty of struggling out there. Maybe a company has a disconnect between the data scientist and the business management folks. Maybe the company is really used to running their business through gut instinct as opposed to really following the metrics. What is your sense of how companies are doing with data analytics these days?
Yeah, James, thank you for the first question there. The reality is most customers are exceedingly comfortable in the domain of analytics.
Hmm.
But having said that, many customers are inefficient in the way that they run and actually create these environments that they're dependent upon.
Hmm.
And if one thing that we've seen probably more so through the lens of COVID and the pandemic over the last 18 to 24 months, those customers, whether they're large enterprise customers, medium or small size customers, have now come to realize how beneficial those analytics and the investments that they had made in the past really are. And if
Hmm.
you look across multiple industries, I think there are certainly some front runner industries that will put a higher premium on analytics,
Hmm.
potentially retailers. If we take a look at manufacturing environments, they've looked at analytics maybe more even through maybe a predictive type of a lens in the past. So I think that the real situation right now is it's dependent upon the industry, it's dependent upon the level of investment that you've made, and then how much capabilities you put into the hands of your, not just your power users, but your average users as well. And I would like to say that from an SAP perspective, we're trying to manage the broad expectations of customers where you have those power users that probably want to look at much more of the management reporting and being able to do self-service. In addition to, of course, maybe the more novice users who really just need to be able to take a far greater level of insight from the data that's presented to them.
I think that's interesting about the more novice users or the more mid-level users, because I'm sure there are plenty of sales reps out there who really need the metrics and they haven't been trained as data scientists, but they're great salespeople. Um, do you think it's a weak area or no? I think it seems like that's the real competitive advantage for companies to get the analytics throughout the enterprise, not just in the C-suite. Are they succeeding even at that lower level?
That's a really good question. I mean, if you take a look at the majority of organizations, they tend to put the, let's call it first class expert level analytics into the hands of their C-suite because they're very demanding, right? And therefore
Right.
the data sets and of course the information that's presented to them is extremely well managed, it's trusted, it gives them the high degree of integrity in decision making. But as you kind of go down the levels, maybe through the hierarchical viewpoint of how data and analytics could be used by general population, that's not necessarily the treatment that most users get. I mean, there aren't
Hmm.
as many sort of first-class environments that could be feeding into those systems that they will then be able to take the analytic value from. And I think this is largely a situation that we've run into historically, but probably has come to bear even more, I guess, headaches for a number of customers now, which is that the level of investment that was being made was probably on the higher end and not on the general population. And that in
Hmm.
itself demands a different mindset and a different level of processing and a different level of governance around the data itself.
Hmm. Well, for those companies that are struggling, that may not be maximizing the use of their analytics, what sort of advice would you give? Because certainly that's a major competitive advantage to really use your analytics really well. I mean, so how should they be doing that?
Well, first things first, I mean, don't treat this like a technical problem. Don't treat this as if it's a situation where you believe that if you get all of the data into pick any one mass storage lake within a hyperscaler environment, your job is done. Your mission is complete. Far
Hmm.
from the truth. All that you're really doing there is you're putting data into one environment, and all of the data that sits around the periphery, you need to be able to integrate, you need to be able to have the same level of connection and being able to drive a lot more contextual value to that same data, not just because it's sat within an environment like a mass storage lake, a data lake. It needs to be much, much more thoughtfully put together as a, call it much more of an integrated environment, right, where analytics itself could be used in a meaningful way. That's kind of the broadest way of looking at it, but maybe the simplest action I would ask customers to look into is If you're not able to look at data in the most holistic way, in the most significant way, and not just in isolation, but within context to your operational data and your historical data, you're probably missing a trick that your competition may actually be using to actually displace you or even leapfrog you. And that's a real risk problem for most organizations.
So look at the data in context. Don't look at the data in isolation.
Correct. And
Yeah.
by isolation, we're talking about, not necessarily having all of the, if you want to call it the historical or the predictive value of that data being used in the most significant way that will help you make informed decisions.
Mhm. Well, let's look at the SAP Business Technology Platform, which includes, as you know, SAP HANA, SAP Analytics Cloud, SAP Data Warehouse Cloud, and SAP Data Intelligence. Certainly, HANA is highly regarded as a database management system. It's got a reputation with extensive transactional analytical capabilities, but are customers requesting a more end-to-end technology approach? I mean, what are the main obstacles and benefits around this approach?
I mean, absolutely, customers are expecting end to end and they're demanding it. But the reality is that they're not going to get that end to end from one single stack or one single vendor. The world is highly heterogeneous. And even
Mhm.
if you have allegiances, pick any one of the North America hyperscalers or even one of the substantial technology providers, your landscapes today and historically have always been very, very heterogeneous. So
Hmm.
from an SAP perspective, our emphasis has really been in making sure that we're multi-cloud, make sure our services are capable of running, just as you described in BTP. BTP is a wide spectrum and an aggregation of technologies. Many technologies, of course, authored and developed by SAP, but equally leveraging a lot of the open source and at the same time the hyperscaler type services as well. So this isn't a version of a storyline that ends with one stack that is completely and wholly consumed by one customer. We have to assume that the natural way of looking at technology now is in that broad spectrum of different options and choices that customers inevitably will be making.
You talk about the heterogeneous environment. It seems to me that the environment is only getting even more heterogeneous. It's going more into multi-cloud than ever before. I mean, there were those long remembered days when we had a data center, it was just in one place, and then there was cloud, and now there's multi-cloud. It seems like the enterprise platform is getting more and more fragmented, and will only get more fragmented, which creates problems for data analytics. Correct? Incorrect?
I think the fragmentation is a reality. Whether it proves to become a problem really depends on the way that you look at the scope of analytics. I mean, I'll give you a couple of data points. I mean,
Hmm.
if we look through the lens of, say, on the persistent side, databases and data management, I
Hmm.
mean, the database market is a very mature market. I mean, it's been in around 50 billion plus, right, for a number of years, and large number of enterprise players have been dominating that market. But what we see right now is a large number of best of breed database providers. Neo4j is a good example, a graph-based database. They last month, in fact, on the 17th of June, raised an additional 325 million, right, to support their endeavors to want to go mainstream. But how many pure blown, kind of graph databases will survive in the future? It's more likely that customers would expect to have that well integrated stack, the collection of services, not the individual service, but the collection of services. And this is where the fragility comes in. If you want to just go into the market and be the best of breed, that in itself may give you some benefits, but the majority of customers do not want to do the heavy lift. They don't want to integrate all these services together. And even if the hyperscalers have a broad spectrum of services, once again, as we just asserted, we're not going to be running in one landscape. You're going to have to then integrate even across hyperscalers. The second data point that I'll give around analytics in particular is that we are seeing a big kind of shift where in Gartner terminology, they talk about this notion of XP&A. So this is extended planning and analysis. SAP has got a number of customers today that, of course, are analytics customers, but we are more often than not now seeing planning being used in pretty much the same cycles from a customer. So therefore, the planning and analytics capabilities, from a planning and analysis perspective, this is really where we start looking at cross analytics, cross planning scenarios, workforce planning, operational workforce planning. These things are really required now because of not just because of the pandemic, because most customers expect this from vendors and expect this from a differentiation in the future.
Interesting. Well, it appears that SAP is making strides in embedding analytics across its portfolio, most recently with the S4 HANA and SuccessFactors. Is the goal here to offer customers analytics everywhere across all SAP solutions? And what's the master plan and what are the possible benefits for a customer?
I mean, analytics everywhere is a must-have now for most organizations, most customers. So absolutely, SAP is embodying that. I mean, the business technology platform at the macro level for SAP is a technology platform that is now being wholly adopted by all of SAP's lines of business. So if you think about SAP being almost a 50-year-old company, it's hard to believe, 50 years in the market. Over
Right.
the last probably decade, having spent approximately 70 billion acquiring a whole host of different SaaS solution assets,
Mhm.
HR, whether it's going to be procurement, whether it's going to be, of course, travel and expense, we've acquired a number of best of breed companies, SuccessFactors, Ariba's, Concur. Each one of them, those environments today, is expecting to be able to integrate with the core ERP. So from an SAP perspective, embedded analytics and cross analytics are becoming almost the currency of success. So you are expecting and you will expect to see analytics everywhere, but analyzing data not just in SAP landscapes, but also more broadly in the non-SAP spaces as well. Because customers expect to have that correlation and that contextualization, James, that you mentioned earlier on as well.
That idea that you mentioned of embedded analytics. I mean, I think I know what embedded analytics is. I think it's worth taking just a second to talk about what is that and why that's important, because I think that's going to be a huge future trend. Why is embedded analytics important, and what is it?
Well, embedded analytics will be, for instance, if you think about the core ERP as a good example, right? I mean, ERP is a very operational sort of centric system, business processes running end to end, being able to manage different types of workforce requirements, or whether it's operational workforce requirements. When
Mhm.
you take a look at the embedded nature of analytics, the idea is that you can effectively do all the necessary, not just the charting, the graphing, that's kind of the elementary stuff, but you also want to be able to do the predictive analytics as an example. So it's not the case where you'd want to siphon off the data, bring it into some kind of a historical repository, and then build some runtime system, be a real-time runtime system on top, and then being able to look more sort of holistically at the data. And these are big words, marketing words, holistic and all that. But what does it really mean when you talk about embed analytics? It means
Mhm.
that there is no movement of data. There is no necessary requirement to have to cleanse the data independently or curate the data. You actually are able to run in a transactional operational system and analytics completely at the core, meaning that there is no kind of friction involved. And as
Mhm.
we now start expanding and zooming out, the idea is that this is not just situated in one environment. Through a gateway kind of an approach that HANA Cloud in particular provides, we can give you a far greater level of embedded analytics because we can harmonize the data into a single persistence layer and then allow all the consumers to have that very well integrated and of course cross analytics experience.
Mhm. All right, so let's take a look to the future of data analytics. Say, 3 to 5 years out. We don't know what's going to happen, but we can take an educated guess. Certainly, the way analytics will be in the future is certainly going to shape business a whole lot. So, what's your prediction, and how can companies be ready for it now?
I mean, number one, I would say AI is everywhere as well. I mean, the,
Hmm.
the foundation of AI is going to become incredibly important. Ethically sourced AI as well, not just the
Hmm.
sort of the AI that most customers and consumers are concerned about. The other aspect of this really is that you need to have a significant foundation, not in just pure technology, but in the way that these business processes are going to be able to look at content and business data and business value. So from an SAP perspective, we are certainly making a lot of inroads in terms of establishing, for example, a data marketplace that will give customers an ability to essentially aggregate the data that they may have in their organizations, but then also be able to monetize the data in some ways or shape or form. And therefore, the analytics future not in the sort of the medium to long term, but even in the short term, really demands that you have a lot of those ingredients. So AI is going to become everywhere, ethically sourced, the ability to start looking at predictive in the same context as analytics. And also, I would say that as we start seeing the emergence of data everywhere, it's no longer the case where you can just assume that data and analytics is within that well-curated, single, unified environment. You have to be able to connect the data everywhere, being able to analyze the value of data irrespective of where it may reside, and then making sure that you can have KPIs and of course mechanisms to govern the data in a significant way, which you don't make any compromises. That's a lot to say, but equally so, there's a lot to do for most organizations to get to that sort of holy grail. And as much of the service delivery that can be provided with that integrated experience, That's really going to be, it's not radical improvements, but it's radical capabilities that are going to be giving every user the ability to do their jobs better.
Mhm. Interesting about the data marketplace you mentioned. It's not just sourced internally. It has third-party sources. But explain the data marketplace idea a little bit.
Yeah, the data marketplace is really the evolution of SAP's heritage, which is we are the custodians and have been for a number of decades at core business content, business value coming from a multitude of different industries. But that's not enough, right? Because most customers have a substantial amount of data that sits either around the periphery or even in different environments that are managed almost in equal weight and proportion. And the data marketplace really is SAP's ability to share not just the semantic value of the data that sits inside of SAP, but then also extending it so that you can enrich the data and ensure, for instance, if other providers like PwC, for example, whether it's going to be any other provider out there who wants to maybe provide sustainability data, you can congregate that data, aggregate that data into the same data marketplace and have locality of service and locality data preserved. So it really is SAP's key differentiation as we go forward, the semantic layer plus the data marketplace, and allowing the SAP world and the non-SAP data sets out there to converge in a way that makes the data much, much more contextual.
Interesting. Irfan, I think you may have said it. Any final thoughts before we wrap up here today?
Well, firstly, James, thank you for hosting me today, and avid listener and of course follower of eWEEK. I think from my standpoint, the most important thing would like to leave the audience with is that, you know, analytics is your friend, right? If you follow the trends, it is your friend. But I would also go as far as saying that don't get stuck into the technical detail, look at the business value, and sometimes projects which have been running for several years and maybe even multiple years have come to the end point where you ask yourself the question, what did we actually learn? What did we actually gain? And this needs to take a different mindset. The pandemic has taught us that we've got to look at short-term wins. And whilst the longer-term vision may be out there, sometimes it's better to have that vision and then backtrack to where you are today and have discrete, digestible pieces to be able to get to that vision. So that's what I would kind of leave the audience with.
All right. Irfan, I think you said it. Thank you very much. I definitely learned something. I appreciate it.
Thank you, James.